Hello, everyone. I am Henry McKembe, CEO of Do Big Things, and welcome to Do Big Talks, where we discuss the latest trend in digital advocacy. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about SMS, changes that are coming, best practice. We're going to get some pro tips from Sandy Fox. As I already said, we're going to be joined today by Smart as a Fox, Sandy Fox, and you guessed it, she is the founder of CEO. She's a wizard on all things SMS, including engagement, guidance, and she's done tons of trainings and presentation. Welcome, Sandy. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Henry. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today, especially as there's, like you said, a lot of changes coming down right now to how organizations and campaigns can run their texting programs. A little bit about me. I have been working in digital for political and nonprofit organizations now for over 14 years. About 4 years ago, I started Smart as a Fox as a digital strategy firm to help organizations with their digital, but more so with their mobile programs. I fell in love with mobile about 7, 8 years ago now, when I had a chance to develop and start Planned Parenthood's broadcast texting program. And since then, I've been working with organizations across the country and internationally on how to build strong and engaging both broadcast and peer-to-peer texting programs.
Thank you. Awesome for that intro. And let's start with that. What is the difference between peer-to-peer and broadcast SMS program? I think a lot of folks still have those all on the digital bucket of mobile engagement. So can you tell us a little bit of the difference in where each come into play when it comes to advocacy?
Yeah, of course. That's actually something that people take for granted. A lot of folks don't really know the difference because they see texting first off as simply receiving a text from a campaign and don't realize that it's a different type of texting. So there's two different types, as I mentioned before. There's broadcast texting, which has actually been around for quite some time. And broadcast texting is basically, think of it as like an email program, but for texting, right? So you use a platform to send out one message out to multiple people at once, right? So I press send and it goes out to thousands of people. Whereas peer-to-peer texting is much newer. It only came around in 2016. It came out of that election cycle, and peer-to-peer was actually created as a workaround. So one of the key things with broadcast texting is that technically it falls under the TCPA, which is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and you have to follow the requirements under that the FCC enforces, which is that in order to text using what they call an auto dialer or a computer basically sending your text message, you need to get an opt-in. You need to get consent, just like with an email program where you need to get them to subscribe to receive messages from you. Now, peer-to-peer, that platform, there's multiple companies that have their own, but they're all created under one concept, which is that a single individual is pressing send on every message. So while the platform itself ups the content for you to send, usually a staff or a volunteer will send that content, there is an actual person pressing send on every message. So this allowed all of these campaigns and organizations to get around that opt-in requirement. And it allowed us to be able to cold text or text audiences who have no relationship with us, namely voters. So we were able to then add texting to our organizing and outreach efforts to cold voter lists. And that's primarily how it's been used. Now, there have been some changes between the FCC and the TCPA, as well as with the carriers and how they enforce both these things. But the main thing that we have to acknowledge is the fact that the status quo should be with broadcast, you should be getting opt-ins. That is currently in flux right now with a current recent Supreme Court decision, but most likely we will see to collect opt-ins for broadcast texting, and you should continue to do so. And then with peer-to-peer, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, there have also been some changes. But according to the FCC, peer-to-peer platforms are still not considered dialers and therefore not required to have an opt-in.
So that makes a lot of sense. So as I understand it, right, is if you want to do broadcast, you need to have opt-in. P2P, you don't need to have opt-in, and you can do cold. And I think that's why we all got a bunch of text messages during the last cycle from an organization that we're not subscribed to remind us to vote. So I'm guessing a lot of that platform we're using P2P. Is that correct?
Yes. So if you've received a text message from a local phone number, that was most likely a peer-to-peer texting message, because typically broadcast texting is required to be from a short code, which is a 5 to 6-digit number. So if you see, for instance, text win to 66539, right? That is a short code, and you'll receive messages from that short code number as well. Or for broadcast, it can be a toll-free or a 866-800 number. But if it's a local regular phone number, that is most likely a peer-to-peer text. And again, there's lots of changes. And I also want to reiterate the fact that texting can be used for audiences that have an opt-in as well. There's nothing stopping you. It just requires more capacity to be able to send all of those messages. So if I press send, I send 1,000 with a broadcast. If I want to send via peer-to-peer, I literally have to press send 1,000
That
times.
sounds like a fun exercise for everybody. So, which leads me to my next question. We saw the explosion of SMS in the last cycle around, but I think it's been focused mostly on electoral efforts and GOTV efforts, right? So where does SMS sit in an advocacy program, which is consistently ongoing? Because a lot of what I see is organization kind of use for kind of a one-time push or a GOTV push, and then get that they've purchased a SMS platform till the next cycle starts around.
Yeah, and that's something I see consistently. Especially since peer-to-peer texting arose and a lot of more organizations started doing texting. A lot of them use it for a single purpose, be it a campaign they're running or an election, and then just forget about it. And this has to do with a couple things, right? Number one, typically a texting program is siloed. So you might have both a broadcast and a peer-to-peer platform, but they live in different departments. So they're not talking to each other and figuring out. And then on top of that, it's siloed outside of the digital strategy or field strategy that you have already set up. So your field team is doing one thing, but you have a broadcast texting platform that you could be using to amplify those field efforts, but they're not talking to each other. So oftentimes, you need to have that person in the room who's going to say, but what about mobile? So if like we're putting together an email or we're putting together an event, oh, how can we integrate mobile into this? And if you don't have that person chiming in and bringing that in to your overall strategy conversation, it's going to get forgotten. And a lot of times what we tend to see is organizations, and I hate to use the term bad actor, but we have a lot of bad actors on campaigns on both sides of the aisle who basically churn and burn with their list. So if, for instance, a candidate starts their mobile list in January, February, ahead of that election, they build, a 1 million person broadcast opt-in texting program with supporters and volunteers and donors. And literally I saw multiple campaigns, including the presidential, crank out multiple texts in a day. The best practice is to send 2 to 4 texts a month. And we're talking about multiple fundraising asks in a month and a week and a day. And so they weren't looking at the other stats. They were only looking at how much money they were raising. And the thing about texting is your best cultivation tool out there. It's your best direct response tool. So if you only use it for the election, so say you're a nonprofit organization, you're only using it for GOTV, or you're only using it for census outreach, right? Once that campaign or whatever you're running is done and you don't text them again, they're going to, number one, forget that they're on your list. So when you text them again, they're going to be mad that they're being texted. Number two, they are most likely not going to engage if they don't already just opt out, right? So you're going to have a less engaged list.
And it just doesn't have to be Congress, like, right? We've done it at the board of supervisor level, we've done it at the state ledge level, and I think sending the SMS to require calls is good. So what I'm hearing saying is that consistency and in terms of engagement and communication is really key to a good SMS and mobile program.
Consistency is key, but also, unlike email, right? The reason we love mobile as a channel is we can easily cut through all that noise. Email, the likelihood of people actually reading your text, your emails is so low. Like if you get a 20% open rate, that's amazing, right? Whereas texting, we found that actually 90% of those who receive your text will read that message within 90 seconds of receiving it. So we're talking about 90% open rates in that sense, right? So it's the best direct response tool because not only are people reading your message, but they're also more likely to respond. We see 4 times as many click-through rates on text than email. We also see response rates. So if we are doing a multiple choice question and you want to have that engagement, because then they really feel like they're a part of your community, right? And it's a cultivation tool. So it doesn't mean you can't ask for money. I highly encourage you do, but you want to do everything in addition to that. You want to, I like to call it the 1/4, right? 1/4 of your message would be fundraising.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that makes sense. Just like we tell our email clients, list like they're an ATM machine. That also applies to mobile.
big time.
So earlier you mentioned that there were some changes coming to the SMS world. Can you dive a little bit into that?
Yeah, it's really complicated. And the mobile world already was pretty complicated. As I mentioned, there's the FCC who enforces the TCPA. And then we have another enforcement body that isn't governmental. It's called the CTIA, which is an association of all the carriers. So T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, they're all members. And after 2020, as you mentioned, there was a lot of texts being sent out in the political and nonprofit space, but not just that. Because of COVID, corporations were using texting for sales, etc., because their stores were no longer had storefronts, right? And people were stuck at home. So texting was really the best way for us to reach them. And it was a presidential election year, and the census was happening. So it was the perfect storm in that people were just inundated with texts from multiple organizations over the course of the year. And towards the end of 2020, the carriers made an announcement that they would be further enforcing their best practices even more so in the last month before the election. And that was the turning point. And there were already plans for a new product to be introduced in 2021. It's something called 10DLC, which actually just stands for 10-digit long code, which is a local phone number, right? And 10DLC was already introduced in 2020 by Verizon. And it was introduced the way that most of us expected it to be introduced in 2020, which was that basically it was creating a local phone number option for companies and organizations to be able to send broadcast text. Because before that, if you sent a broadcast text via a long code or local phone number, your messages would most likely get blocked by the carriers because that was considered a peer-to-peer texting window, right? So this new product, 10DLC, was supposed to give companies the ability to register and have the ability to then have a special lane on that peer-to-peer highway, right? So the carriers decided we're going to be a little more now. If an organization is sending a message via a long code or regular phone number using any type of technology, meaning I'm not texting you, Henry, on my phone, I'm using a computer platform or program to be able to send those messages, I need an opt-in.
That is a huge change.
So it's a huge change. Their definition of peer-to-peer is different from ours. Their definition of peer-to-peer means that literally it's me as an individual sending you a text. And if it's not that, it's not peer-to-peer.
Two questions to wrap us up. When are those changes taking effect, and what should organization be doing to prep for those changes to the SMS program?
Yeah. So also fun complications. So technically, in March, AT&T started implementing and released their 10 DLC. May 1st, T-Mobile will be fully launching its 10 DLC. We are now in what they consider a grace period, where they're making sure that everyone who's running campaigns or is planning to run campaigns has time to register with this new entity called the campaign registry. And once that grace period ends, if you are not registered and try to send a text message from a long code or regular phone number, right, they're going to basically block your messages from going through.
Interesting. And then how would the platform be dealing with this? So the platforms that are being used for P2P, for example.
So there's a lot of advocacy that is currently happening. There's several coalitions, a combination. We have coalitions of vendors, we have coalitions of consultants, we have coalitions of nonprofit organizations, we have coalitions of political organizations, all working on advocating for a exception for civic engagement and political. And so the key thing I should note is that grace period was supposed to end on June 1st. And they, a few weeks ago, said, okay, we're actually not going to have June 1st be the end of that grace period, but we're not giving you a date. We'll give you 30 days notice when that grace period ends.
Fair enough. Well, Sandy, thank you so much for joining us. It sounds like we need to have you back when the grace period has ended so we can figure out what those changes are and how we can advise our nonprofits to take action moving forward. How does that sound?
That sounds great. And I highly recommend, I realize I didn't fully answer your question. I highly recommend organizations start investing in an opt-in program, just because it is really a great cultivation tool. It won't replace peer-to-peer and the benefits of that, but it is something that can definitely be done. And I'm happy to talk about it another
Absolutely.
time.
Yes. Opt-in is always best. We all know that from email and from other sources of engagement. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us for another installment of Do Big Talks. If you have any topics you'd like to discuss, shoot us a note at info@dobigthings.com and stay tuned for future episodes.